shot him, supposedly in the top of his head, and killed him. That's the Warren Commission conclusion at that time. However, probably no more than 20%, if even that, of the American population accepted that as a real story. Everybody felt like there was a great deal more to that in some way. And that then caused the great dissension that went on in the discussion in the country about whether there was one or more shooters, whether there was or was not then a conspiracy. In fact, this was discussed so much in the country that finally, in 1976, Congress formed a House Special Select Assassinations Committee to look into this more carefully even perhaps than the Warren Commission. And they indeed, like many things Congress does, took a great deal of time from 1976 to 79 in this committee studying all the circumstances of the assassination. The interesting thing was that they concluded at the end of that time in 1979 that yes, there had been a conspiracy, there was more than one shooter. It was not like the Warren Commission said, and this was now the official congressional version of what happened. However, the other strange thing that happened is that they said we're not at liberty, though, at the present time until 50 years from now to give out the full details of what happened. And so that's where they left it. And that's where it is still to this day, about the details of that, although there was an official statement that yes, there was a conspiracy, there was more than one shooter. And since that time, I've kind of maintained, of course, an interest in this. First thing I saw that made me think that yes, there was more than one shooter, even before this official version came out, as did many people, about 6 or 7 years, as I recall now, after the assassination of President Kennedy, the so-called Zapruder film, which was made by Mr. Abraham Zapruder of the shooting when he happened to be standing down on the grassy knoll at the time of the assassination and had his movie camera with him, and he took a picture of this and recorded the entire shooting of the president. And what is shown on that film, and I'm sure many of you can recall that and having seen it, the first thing you see on Mr. Zapruder's film is the motorcade slowly proceeding down toward the Triple Underpass. It comes off of Houston Street and then makes a slow turn onto Elm Street, going down toward the Triple Underpass there in downtown Dallas. The car then moves slowly out of that turning position, and just as he goes through the turn and the driver slows down a good deal to make the turn, you see the president's hands go up to his neck as if something has happened. And then the motorcade moves on down Elm Street and disappears behind a large sign that's there at the edge of Elm Street for a few seconds, so maybe 3 or 4 seconds. And then the car comes out from behind that street sign and moves down toward the Triple Underpass again. And now you see that the president still has his hands up to his neck, and obviously something has happened. And Mrs. Kennedy now has realized this too and is leaning over to him as if to say, what's wrong? And as she does that, the president's head literally explodes, and he's thrown violently backward and to the left, as if a bullet had hit him in the head from the front, from the grassy knoll, the picket fence and the grassy knoll. And that, indeed, I think is what happened. That there was a shooter in the second floor of the book depository, and their bullet hit the president in his back and came out this hole that we saw in his neck. And then as the motorcade proceeded on down Elm Street, the second shooter behind the picket fence with a rifle, a very high-powered rifle, fired a bullet that probably hit him right in the hairline. We didn't see anything there, but the president's head was covered with blood, and he had that copious head of hair. And you could have had a bullet wound here, which I'm sure he did, that we just didn't see. But then that blew out the back of his head and blew out the back half of his right cerebral hemisphere and his cerebellum. That's how low it came out of the back of his head. So that's what happened, I think. And the question comes, who were both of the shooters? Was one of them Oswald, and then another one, the thinking is now that the shooter behind the picket fence was a hired assassin hired by the mafia under the aegis, as it turns out later, of Carlos Marcello, who was the head of the mafia in New Orleans at that time, who probably hired the assassins. There were actually two people behind the picket fence. And about 5 years ago, I met Mr. Ed Hoffman at a dinner where they were a group of people meeting about the assassination, and I'd been invited to that. And they seated me at a table with Mr. Ed Hoffman and his wife and their daughter. And it turns out that Mr. Hoffman had seen the shooting from behind the picket fence. Mr. Hoffman, on the day of the assassination, was working at Texas Instruments and injured a tooth while he was eating his lunch, and asked to be relieved to go to Arlington to see his dentist, which they did. They let him go, and he was driving out on that day toward Arlington to see his dentist. He knew that they were having the president in town. All of us knew that, of course. And as he came on to drive on to Stemmons, they were pulling traffic off of Stemmons in order to let the president's motorcade go by. He had been scheduled to give a speech at the Trade Center at noon. That's where he was headed that day. And so they were pulling traffic off of Stemmons in order to let the motorcade get by to the place where the president was going to speak. Of course, he never made it because he was shot there on the way. Anyway, as they pulled it off, Mr. Hoffman's car was pulled off right behind the area where the picket fence and the grassy knoll was. And at that time, many years ago now, there was little or no growth or vegetation or trees there now like there is at the present time. You couldn't see what he saw now. But he could clearly see from a position maybe about 400 feet behind the picket fence, he saw two men. One was dressed in a business suit, standing right behind the picket fence. The other one was a man in workman's coveralls carrying what appeared to be a tool bag. And as he took this in, he got out of his car and stood by the side of his car and looked and see. He could see the motorcade coming toward the underpass as he got out of his car. And as the motorcade came down toward the triple underpass and toward the area where Mr. Hoffman could see everything from that viewpoint, he said the man in the business suit standing right behind the picket fence lifted a rifle up that he had been holding with its butt on the ground in front of him, placed it on top of the picket fence, fired the rifle, and Mr. Hoffman saw the bullet hit the president in the head, and then saw the motorcade race off toward Parkland. After that, Mr. Hoffman said the man who had fired the rifle took the rifle, kind of loped over about 15 or 20 feet away to the man who had been standing with the coveralls, and they took a tool bag and tossed the rifle to him. This man broke the rifle down, put the rifle into the tool bag, and walked slowly off down the railroad track there behind the picket fence and the grassy knoll, and disappeared. With that, of course, the crowd, many people in the crowd heard the bullets being fired from the picket fence, and there was a large crowd of people ran up toward the picket fence. And in fact, as Mr. Hoffman kept standing there, he said a policeman came around from the crowd and behind the picket fence and walked over to the man who was there with this business suit on, and came up to him. And of course, Mr. Hoffman couldn't hear what was said. He was too far away for that. But he said the policeman obviously asked the man something, and the man reached inside of his coat pocket, pulled out some identification papers, and showed them to the policeman. policeman looked at him and nodded his head, and the policeman and the man in the business suit then walked together, just nonchalantly out from behind the fence and disappeared into the crowd. Mr. Hoffman, having seen that, just left his car there and went across to a sub-police station that was there near Dealey Plaza, and walked in and tried to tell them what he saw. Now, why I said tried to tell them, unfortunately, Mr. Hoffman was a deaf mute. And so they wouldn't pay any attention to him. They thought he was just some crazy guy that had wandered in. The next Thanksgiving day out at Garland, his family was having a Thanksgiving dinner that immediate, few days after the assassination. And Mr. Hoffman, who at that time was 32 years old, was there with his family, and one of his family members was a police detective on the Dallas police force. And so he thought, oh good, I can get my story across to him. And he was there in a room with his father and his father's brother, who was his uncle, who was on the police force. And he tried to tell both of them what he had seen in some detail. And he said when he did that, his uncle, the police detective, walked over to him, grabbed him by the lapels, and pulled his face up into him so he could see his lips move. And Mr. Hoffman could read lips, and he said, "Ed, you keep your mouth shut or you're going to be killed." And that was the last thing he said to him about that. And so I heard that story, as I said, about 4 or 5 years ago. And I was talking to Mr. Hoffman and his wife, who's also deaf mute, but their daughter was sort of translating for me what Mr. Hoffman was saying. So that's just another thing that sort of a little direct assessment of what maybe went on there.